Welcome to the Ask Dad podcast by Soul Bliss Empire with Rachel and Jim. This is the podcast where science meets spirituality, and our mission is to expand consciousness. You have arrived.
Hello and welcome back to Ask Dad. I'm Rachel and this is Jim, aka Dad. Tonight we are going to be talking about a new way to talk about religion and how often religion and spirituality are conflated to be the same thing when in fact they are not really. So let's start with that. And can you tell us, Jim, how spirituality and religion are in fact quite different?
Sure. Okay. So starting off, we often use the terms religion or religious and spirituality as meaning the same thing. And really what we are thinking of is, we're thinking of religion, we're thinking of in terms of world's most famous religions like Christianity or Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and they're organized religions. They have sacred texts that people rely on and go by, and so it has a bit of a structure. So religion we think of in terms of having that sort of the historical structure, traditional structures that we separate and classify as being religions, and then somebody who's religious is following those religions, where spirituality is involved in all of the religions but is maybe a little bit more, I think, is generally how we perceive those terms. And the idea of being spiritual is has to do with just, I think, recognizing the energies, the subtle energies that are all around us. So if somebody is, in prayer, they're opening themselves up to a subtle energy. They're wanting to converse with their God or their conception of God. I think in this context of discussion, that the religion is a more constrained version of the topic, and the spirituality is more open. And so that's what I kind of like the idea of a new way to look at religion, is basically just opening up all of those constraints and not thinking in terms of, oh, I was of this religion and now I'm more open and my ideas don't conform to that religion anymore. And I'm of the opinion just to wash all of those religious boundaries away, and just talk about in terms of the energy and the spirituality of it.
Whoops, I forgot to unmute myself. I like how you said like the boundaries of religion and how to make them more flexible. Why do you think religions created those boundaries to begin with and made them so rigid often?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think a lot of times they're centered around a person. Right? You have Buddhism's around Buddha, Christianity is around Jesus Christ, Islam is around Muhammad. So you have this leader that creates this structure, and it's quite a phenomenon, really, when you think of it, how that just that one man, and I guess in some cases could be women as well, but it seems like generally the ones that we think about are generally started by men. And then they create a following, and then they create it, there's traditions, and there's just sort of a way of doing things that's an accepted way of channeling one's spirituality to talk to God and to get back to God, to when we leave this earth, to travel in an acceptable way to the hereafter and all those mysteries. And I think a lot of it is, I think mystery is kind of the key thing that I find is the restrictive aspect of it, in terms of, a mysticism or a secretiveness that is a veil. There's a veiling that goes on with these traditions, and sort of like you put the Buddha or Jesus Christ or Muhammad on this pedestal, and the average person can never attain to it, or can never approach to it. And I think it's unnecessarily restrictive, and I think the restrictive aspects of it are actually inbred in our minds. And so it's the actual restrictions in the authoritarian societies that we and our ancestors have grown up in that create this structured framework that limits the idea of what's acceptable, and what's a proper way of handling our spirituality. And then we classify that as a religion. The religion is the proper way to handle our spirituality.
And how do you think that affects our sovereignty as a whole world? Religion, with the constraints and the boundaries, how does that affect our sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, it puts us back into another type of authoritarian hierarchy. And this time we have God at the top, and then we have the leader of the religion is at the sort of the earthly pinnacle of the hierarchy. And then of course you have the priests or priestesses and the religious hierarchy that comes down from that. And so we create an authoritarian structure of that again creates these walls and these constraints for our spirituality. And so I think that's really the idea of the new way of looking at it, is to remove those and realize. I like to think of, like we think of personal sovereignty, I like to think of a religion of one. I'm I'm directly have direct access to source and to God, right, to the universal mind. And really, I think being, I guess you'd say, an ex-Christian, a Reformed Christian, that's I don't subscribe to the tenets of Christianity, but I still really appreciate the teachings of Jesus. And I think that's what Jesus taught, is that he taught that you can come directly to God. And that the hierarchical system that we're in, that has to do with our government structures. I mean, and even in fairly recent times, being under a king, being the subject of a king or a queen. Of course, in Canada, we're still under a queen. Britain, a lot of the world's population. I mean, it's the US is the only ones that technically don't have a king, but they have a structure as well. But that we're so wired to that structure that we have allowed those constraints to be in our mind, and it's really just an obstacle to freedom. I think the freedom is best described as our natural state. We're just born free, but then there's obstacles that get put in the way. And so when we think of gaining freedom, it's just really we have to remove those obstacles. And I've come to the place and the opinion now that the religious tracks and structures that are in the world are just an impediment to our freedom.
That's very interesting, because it's sort of mirrored in how our world is set up, and it's becoming more obvious that there are a lot of boundaries and societal boundaries and constructs in place that are restricting our freedoms. I know when I first started thinking about sovereignty and a religion of one, I struggled with the idea, if I'm sovereign and everybody else is sovereign, then how do we co-create and commingle together? How does community work when everybody is sovereign? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so I was really impressed one time when I saw it was a giant wheel of the world's, I guess you would say, most popular or the most populous religions by number. If you add up, the big three, I guess, would be Judaism, Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, and Muslim, Islam, those ones. And then if you stretch those ones out till I think it's the top 26, that have the most people getting down into Jainism, and some of the ones that maybe not everybody knows, but have a few million adherents over in areas of the world. So what you would say maybe the top 20 or 25 major religions in the world all have some version of the golden rule. And to me, it's so beautiful, right? Treat your neighbor as you would yourself. It's so simple, it's so perfect, it's so beautiful. And so as a personal sovereign, I'm going to look at you and treat you as I treat myself. And everybody seems to agree on that. Like, yeah, I guess that's my point, is there's I would say as close to a universal agreement to that principle as one could possibly hope to achieve in this world. And that's enough.
So why don't you think that is happening? Because obviously on a macro scale, we are not treating our neighbor as we would treat ourselves. Probably within our more intimate circles we are. But like I said, on the macro scale, you don't see that happening. So why do you think that is? Why do you think people can't follow the golden rule when it comes to society at large?
Yeah, and so I think that gets down to the idea of not understanding life energy. And so it's sort of one of those things that you don't know that you don't know. And just being able to go out into nature and to just look and pause and just realize that nature just is, right? There's no there's really no good, there's no evil, there's just contrast, and it just is. And then a lot of people will say how that just nature is just connected, to God at every level. There's no separation. It just is, and it is part of the creation. And that's really my view of God, is that God is in all of the creation. And so there's really no way to anthropomorphize God, right? And say, he's the man up in the clouds, looking down like Santa Claus and knows when we've been good and when we've been bad. That's not what it's about. That's not the concept of God. And that allows, so all the things that allow for a hierarchy is just something that we've imposed from the psychology of our own mind, which is born from generations of authoritarian structure.
Right.
And so it's when you get into actually putting off that non-life or that anti-life structure, that's what takes some time. And that's what I think, if you get into, meditating in nature and just understanding, even when you brought up how the macro society is different from our micro society, like most people get the idea that with their family and friends, they're going to treat them well and be nice. Like that's kind of our default, right? Like we want to be nice to people, right? We're not thinking of how we can kill our neighbor and take over their house. But then countries think like that. Like, I want to kill this structure, their military, and I want to take over their country, like what's happened all, even up to this day. You've got, people amassing their armies on other people's borders and wanting to take control of their people and resources. And so this is an anti-life structural framework that goes deep into our minds. What we need to recognize is that it's in all of our minds, right? None of us are immune from this. And even though we can get by with not having it in our micro society with our friends and our family and all that, and then we can go into nature and we can see, it's at peace there, right? There's peace there. But on our macro scale, on our social institutions, the only reason they're like that is because there's some structure in our mind that allows that to happen. And so that's the deep work that each one of us that has to take a personal responsibility and go, okay, that's where it has to change. That's where that character structure that's in my character has to change, and I need to be able to put off the hierarchy and just be more functional, just be able to function as a living entity. And in that context, that's when you can see religion in a new way.
For sure. I think a big part of it too is structured in fear. Now, maybe that's not how it started, but now there's this huge fear. It's like, well, if I don't protect myself against my neighbor that I don't know, the neighbors that you do know, you like you're in a circle, right? You tend to not have to build up defenses against them. But say people that you don't know whether they're good or bad, or however you want to classify that. But we always tend to take the stance and assume that they are potentially untrustworthy, and then build up defenses for that. And that is completely rooted in fear. And so I think that it's helpful knowing that, because then once you discover that the reason that you're not following the golden rule everywhere else, or rather not in the macro society, is because you're afraid that somebody else is going to screw you over, so you defend against it before it even happens.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true on a national level.
Yeah.
Between certain nations.
Yeah.
A lot of countries feel peaceful with each other. Interestingly enough, it's like all the Christian nations feel comfortable with each other, but maybe not with some of the Muslim nations, and then of course some of the Muslim nations, not to give Muslim religion a bad name, but some of them, there's radical, you have to make the distinction between Muslim and radical Muslim, right? But and then on the broader scale, and this may be a controversial topic, but when you think of it, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all believe in Jehovah as God.
That's true.
And Jehovah, if you look at Jehovah, he's got a very bad track record in terms of, life and anti-life, being a respecter of life. Like there's times when he just says, kill them all, and dash their babies against the stones, and don't let any of them grow up, because they'll just come and when they grow up, they'll just come and kill you. So just got to kill them all, even kill their cows. There's some of them, they're so unclean and they're so bad that you just got to kill all their livestock as well. That's a very unusual, sort of, I would say, anti-life standpoint. And when you dial it all the way back, right, to the, because being a Christian for over 20 years, I read my Old Testament, and I learned, basically Jewish history, right? I know Jewish history. I've read the Jewish history book. It's called the Old Testament, right? I've read the Bible stories. I read them to my kids. I've memorized them. I taught Sunday school. I've done all these things. I'm, a fairly educated person in Jewish history. And one of the tenets of Jewish history is that they believe that they were the chosen people, right? Going all the way back to Abraham. And Abraham said, do this. If you're faithful, your offspring will be as the stars of the sky and as the sand of this by the seashore, and in multitude, right? And all of these people, and you will be a chosen race unto me. And then when they came to bring that into fruition into the land of Canaan, right? They came in with Joshua, and they annihilated all of the Canaanites, right? Because that was their promised land, which is now Israel. And so their whole premise of their history is that they are God's chosen people, and everybody else can just feckin' die, right? That's, putting it a little bit bluntly, but that's what it is. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of being a chosen race and causing a division in humanity is a very damaging psychological precedent, right? It creates the ultimate division in humanity itself. And I believe that is the fundamental mind virus that all of the hierarchy and social violence stems from. And it's a bit of a radical thought, but when you think about it, and then Islam is based on the same idea, and they have, right, and theirs is the Jewish people are very interesting in that you have to be born, right? A Jew. And then, sometimes they would admit new members if they were, very, what was the word? They would, there was some, extreme circumstances where they, if you weren't born a Jew, you could kind of get into the club, if you did certain things, and being circumcised and, and following all the, there's a few things there was a checklist, right? You had to meet the checklist and then you could possibly be a proselyte.
It's like becoming a citizen of another country, right? There's a lot of things you have to do.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good analogy. You had to jump through some hoops,
Yeah.
And so it wasn't a form of religion that was going to grow very fast, right? You had to be born into it. Okay. Now Islam, and if you think of it in terms of a virus, that's kind of a stagnant virus. It's not going to, it's not going to take over. It's, it's a virus, but it's kind of benign in a sense, in a certain way of speaking.
Not as many hosts.
Yeah, it's not gonna infect as many hosts because you got to be born into it, so it's kind of contained. Now you have the Islam, and if you look at the history of Islam, it was a warlike religion at the beginning,
and their idea was
right? What's that?
Christianity was too, with the Knights Templar and back in the
they were fighting the Muslims.
That's true.
The whole Crusades, they were going back into Jerusalem because the Muslims had come in and had physically taken over the land. And so they were like a military force coming in to take over in an Old Testament kind of a way, but with being Muslim instead of Jewish.
Right.
Right. Because they were the son of the concubine. Right? Isaac was the son of the promise from, so you had Abraham and
Ishmael, right?
Sarah.
Oh, and Sarah, yeah.
Right. And Sarah begat Isaac when she was like 95 or something. He was a miracle child. So he was the son of promise. And that was the father, Isaac, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob became Israel, right? That's the son of the promise. Whereas you had Ishmael, which was the son of the concubine, which Abraham left out into the desert, took Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert to die, basically, and just shunned them and said, no, you got to go. And then Hagar and Ishmael had an angel come to them in the desert, and, they got water and they survived. And that's where the Muslim people feel like their lineage comes from, right? Is from Abraham through Hagar and Ishmael instead of through Sarah and Isaac. Right. And so, but now it's a virulent form of the virus. They're like, the virus, a virulent form wants to come and kill you. Right. And it makes me think of that I think it's Jeff Dunham that has that puppet, and it's like the terrorist, right? He says, "I'll kill you." He was Ahmed, the dead terrorist, because he was a suicide bomber, and he makes fun of this. I think somebody made a great point, is that the hallmark, I think it's a quote from someone, I don't know, a writer somewhere, who said that the telltale sign of tyranny is their lack of nuance. They just take away all nuance. Everything is just black and white. There's no room for humor or other opinions and all this kind of thing. And so, so I'm kind of coming in the face of tyranny here, and just, blowing up and basically calling, Jehovah, the whole idea of Jehovah, as a mind virus. That the idea that Jehovah selected and made people, the chosen people, and that idea of separating the human race into chosen and unchosen is a virus. It's deadly, and that whole thing needs to be rejected. And so and of course it creates all these, I know I was speaking in terms of hierarchies and things that are in our mind, but it's kind of going down to the very roots, right? So then you have Christianity, which is like the Omicron now, where it's not as deadly, but it just spreads like crazy, right? and Christians are like that, right? They just want to like proselyte everybody and have, set up a big tent and everybody come in and, confess Jesus as your savior, and boom, you're saved, and off you go, and boom, now you get the stamp, right? Now you're a Christian, and bang, 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 and it just spreads like wildfire. And so you have basically 3 different forms of a virus, of the same virus. So I am treating everybody equally. I'm all putting them in the same basket of a virus. They're just different strains. And so all of it is just, and that's the subject I'm familiar with. And of course you get into, the Eastern religions, which I'm less familiar with. But still they in a different way, they gain the same kind of constraints. And I'm just all for taking away all the constraints and having them connect. And if people want to, there's people that connect through angels or through ascended masters. There's the ideas of galactic beings that are all of these are from source, right? These are all, and we're realizing that the universe itself is aware and intelligent. And so it makes sense that there's other forms of intelligence besides humans. Even dolphins are, probably as intelligent as us and just have different, they have a different
way of communicating. Yeah, different. And we don't understand it because we don't communicate the same way.
Yeah.
Right. And therefore we usually look at it as less than. But yeah, I've heard of people saying that, especially people who work with dolphins, saying that they're just as intelligent as us.
So, and this is I admit it's a very open way of thinking, but it's the way that I've come to thinking of spirituality.
Yeah.
And it's it makes sense to me, and it makes sense that and so I don't look down on anyone if they're of whatever religious persuasion. And on the positive side, I would say to people that if they've been raised up and they're in a community, I wouldn't shun the community or anything. It depends on everybody's individual choice. There's some people that want to have because every community is just people, and it's just people that are following a certain hierarchical track in their mind, and as long as that serves you, then fine. I wouldn't denounce anybody if they went to a Catholic church, or they went to a monastery, or they went to a any kind of temple, or or mosque or anything. It's just that's not the issue, right? The issue is we need to put off of the constraints that are in our mind, and we need to get rid of all the obstacles to freedom that are not just in religion, but in our society as well.
Definitely. It's an us versus them mentality. And that's like the whole point of it, back to what you were just saying, where there's no judgment if you are in a religion or not, right? Like that's the whole point of it, is that there is no us versus them. We're all in this together,
right.
This thing called life, right? And to judge another person for their way of living doesn't make any sense, because you're not living their life, so how could you possibly know what is going to work best for them?
Right. And I'm not going to, so yeah, who am I to come in and restrict, offer any restrictions or cancellations or, judgmental negative opinions to what they're doing? That's not my place. Right. I have no energy for that. Just condemning everybody all the time. Where's the peace there? Right.
No, exactly. But I think that people have sort of become addicted to that behavior. There's like a dopamine hit or something when they're like, oh, that's bad, or the judging part of it. For some reason, it's makes them feel better for a little bit. I don't know. I definitely used to be a fairly judgmental person because I thought my way was the right way. But as I've gone down this path, I've started realizing it's like there really are as many ways as there are people to do things, going back to religion of one and personal sovereignty. And so I think it's the mind virus you talk about that is really creating this judgment from other people, and why they look down on other people when they don't feel like they're doing it the right way. And so I think that's where people could really improve isn't really the right word, I don't think, but it's like, that's, if they want to change something, that's where they can start. If you really want to change your life, in the way.
And I think that's what spills over into our nation states, and then then you get into nations acting other than the golden rule.
Yeah,
and you get a breakdown in what I would call truth. That I would call that truth. That and so it starts to break down, but it breaks. It's tricky because it breaks down all the way back at the basic level, and then it bleeds through our whole psychology and infects our religion and our society, and in so many different ways. It creates that us versus them, right? The chosen and unchosen.
That's right. Yeah.
And we do the choosing in our own mind.
Yeah. Our
endlessly.
Yeah, exactly. Our what's the word for it? Our very undependable mind. It's so easily programmed and corrupted, right? But it's like the golden decision maker in our society, right? When it really needs to be the heart, in my opinion. We've seen that where people make decisions from the heart, they have success, whereas from the mind, it's usually more temporary success, if successful at all. But yeah, it's all very, very interesting stuff. Did you have anything else? Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think that's I think that's it.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting conversation and enlightening. As always, you can find us on Instagram at Soulless Empire, on the web, soullessempire.com, and I will link all of that below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.